I've never been one to dress for approval. Comfort, simplicity, respect, that's always been enough for me. So when the day finally came to meet Ethan's family, I didn't try to impress anyone. I chose a soft blouse, my favorite coat, and those leather shoes I'd had resoled twice because they've carried me through important days before. But as the plane touched down, my chest tightened. This wasn't just a visit. It felt more like walking onto a stage I hadn't been invited to, only tolerated on. Ethan had always described them as old money. You know, the kind who value legacy and appearance like it's a religion. He said it with a nervous kind of fondness, the way someone laughs at a relative who's a little cruel but still sends checks on birthdays. He never rushed to introduce me. Said they were particular. That word stuck with me. Particular. It didn't mean they were picky. It meant they judged. Quietly. Constantly. But I told myself I was ready. Love had brought me here. That should have been enough. Their house looked like a postcard no one was allowed to touch. Massive, cold, perfect. As we walked to the door, I could feel the stone path pulling my confidence apart, step by step. I stood behind Ethan, hands tucked in my coat, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest. His mother opened the door with a smile so sharp it could have sliced bread. Her kiss landed on air. A quick glance at my outfit, then a longer glance at my shoes. I felt smaller, like I'd shown up speaking the wrong language. At first, they were polite. Just enough to say they tried. But I caught the looks, the quick glances at each other, the pause before answering me, like they needed time to decide if I was worth the breath. And then came the question. Where did you buy your shoes? The words were dipped in syrup, but followed by a smirk so bitter it dried my mouth. I opened mine to answer, but I didn't get the chance. I don't think I expected warmth, but I had hoped for something real. Instead, everything felt like a performance, one where I'd clearly been miscast. We sat in the parlor, this immaculate space with ivory curtains and portraits of stern ancestors watching us like I owed them something. His sister offered me tea with a smile that never touched her eyes, then whispered something to their housekeeper while glancing my way. I pretended not to hear. Pretended a lot, actually. Ethan tried. I could tell. He squeezed my hand a little too often, laughed a little too loud. It was his way of keeping the peace, of covering the cracks. But every time someone made a veiled comment about fresh perspectives or how some people value experience over education, I caught him shrinking. He didn't stand up for me. Not really. And that was a silence louder than all their words combined. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to meet fire with fire, but something in me said, wait, just observe. My mother once told me, let people talk long enough and they'll show you everything you need to know. And my God, did they talk. They joked about people with new money trying too hard. They rolled their eyes at how minimalism was just a fancy word for being broke. They didn't ask me about my work, not once. I stopped trying to belong about 15 minutes in, but the thing that struck me, really stayed in my gut, was how convinced they were that I was beneath them. As if my quietness was weakness. As if my clothes, my manner, even my silence, were signs of lack. They mistook modesty for emptiness. And as they sipped from their crystal glasses and told stories that circled around privilege like a carousel, I smiled. Because what they didn't know was that I could buy this entire house twice over and still have enough left to send them a thank you card for the hospitality. Dinner was announced like it was a royal event. We moved into a dining room so polished it practically echoed. The table was already set. Fine china, gold-rimmed glasses, centerpieces that looked like they'd been professionally arranged. I found my seat, placed between Ethan and his sister, and folded my napkin with care, as if that one small act could anchor me in place. I kept telling myself, this is just one night. But sitting there, I felt like I was back in high school, at a lunch table where I didn't belong. Their stories excluded me, intentionally. Jokes wrapped in references I wasn't supposed to understand. Moments of forced laughter, followed by quick glances to see if I was amused. I wasn't. I was studying them. Every expression, every deflection, every little way they worked so hard to remind me that I was not one of them. What they didn't realize is, I never wanted to be. When dessert came, so did the final blow. A casually cruel remark about how far some girls will go just to marry up. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't laugh either, but he didn't speak. And that, more than anything, was the sound that cracked something inside me. I stared at the flame of the candle in front of me, let its stillness calm my hands. I sipped my wine and nodded along as if their judgment hadn't just nailed me to the chair. But inside, something shifted. They thought I was nothing more than a woman lucky to be there. But I've never relied on luck. I've built every step of my life. I've made sacrifices they wouldn't last a day making. And as I looked around that table, at the smug smiles and shallow pride, I felt no need to impress them. Only a quiet, blooming certainty that this entire house ran on money they didn't even know was mine. They laughed, thinking I had nothing. I just smiled, knowing they owed me everything. Dinner should have been the place where things softened, where food smoothed out edges and people found common ground, but not in this house. Here, dinner felt like an audition, like I was being watched for flaws in my posture, the way I held my fork, even how I pronounced bouillabaisse. I sat straight, smiled when I needed to, but inside I was tired of pretending I couldn't feel the condescension pressed into every sentence. Ethan's mother was the first to strike. She didn't raise her voice or say anything outright cruel. No, her weapon was polished. "It must feel so exciting for you," she said as she passed me the asparagus. "Finally sitting at a real table." I blinked, just blinked, because part of me couldn't believe it was that easy for her, to twist a sentence and turn dinner into a lesson on who belonged. I thanked her politely and chewed slowly, like grace could be tasted. His father chimed in next, laughing at his own joke about international charity cases. I was the only one not laughing. Ethan shifted in his seat. He muttered something about how Rochelle has her own business, but his voice trailed off like he'd lost his place in the script. His sister didn't miss a beat. She leaned toward me and asked, all wide-eyed and sugar-sweet, "Have you ever been in a 5-star hotel before?" I didn't answer right away, mostly because I was deciding whether to laugh, cry, or order champagne. I chose none of the above. I chose silence, controlled, watchful silence. I've learned that sometimes dignity speaks loudest when it says nothing at all. I looked each of them in the eye, one by one, and nodded with the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable. Because I wasn't shrinking. I was watching, cataloging, waiting. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't insulting a guest at their table. They were taunting the very woman who was unknowingly paying for the meal they so proudly served. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. I wasn't someone they were trying to know. I was a project they were dissecting. Every word was layered with judgment dressed up as curiosity. They wanted to box me in, label me, reduce me to something small enough to ignore. And Ethan sat there with that polite tension in his jaw. He said nothing when his sister called my earrings quaint, or when his father asked if I'd adjusted to indoor plumbing. I waited for him to speak. He didn't. I could feel the heat behind my ears, but I never let it reach my face. I kept my hands steady, my voice even. I answered questions they didn't really want answers to. "Yes, I grew up in a small town," I said. "No, I didn't attend a finishing school." I let them assume. Let them believe the narrative they needed to feel superior. Because that's what this was. Not dinner, but theater. And I had unknowingly walked into the spotlight. What they didn't realize was that I've played tougher rooms. I've sat in boardrooms with men twice my age who smiled at me like I was decoration. I've had clients demand discounts because they assumed I couldn't possibly own the business. I've built everything I have with hands they would never notice, calloused not from labor, but from building empires in silence. And this dinner, it was a performance they thought I didn't understand. But I'd memorized the script before they finished Act 1, and so I played the part. The quiet girl. The humble guest. I smiled at the insults, nodded at the mockery, and let them laugh at a version of me that never existed. Inside, I was doing the math. I was adding up every comment, every smirk, every passive-aggressive toast. And somewhere in the middle of that second course, it clicked. They weren't just wrong about me. They were living in a world I'd already outgrown, one I happened to be funding without their knowledge. They clinked their glasses and toasted to tradition, as if the past alone gave them character. I raised mine too, without a word, because what could I say that wouldn't sound like thunder in their delicate ears? They were so sure they were better than me, so sure I should be grateful to breathe their air, sit in their house, eat from their plates. But I wasn't flattered. I was studying every inch of this moment, committing it to memory. Because the ones who laugh the loudest often fall the hardest. What they never asked, and never would, was what I did for a living. Not really. Ethan had mentioned freelance, which they clearly interpreted as figuring things out. I let them. I let them build that illusion, because sometimes it's useful to be underestimated. You get to move quietly, observe fully, and strike exactly when no one's looking. And let me tell you, they weren't looking at all. They were too busy performing superiority to realize the foundation beneath them wasn't theirs. By dessert, their cruelty had dulled into a rhythm, backhanded questions, tone-deaf stories about vacationing in real poverty, even a comment about rescuing animals and people from the streets. I nodded. I smiled. But in my mind, I was already walking through spreadsheets, wire transfers, and property deeds. Because that vineyard they were so proud of, I knew exactly who held the LLC. And soon they would too. But not tonight. No. Tonight, they could keep pretending they were the center of the universe. When I finally stood to excuse myself, I thanked them sincerely, because I meant it. Not for the food, not for the hospitality, but for the clarity. That dinner was the final layer peeled back. I didn't need to guess anymore. I knew exactly who they were, and more importantly, I knew exactly who I was. They laughed, thinking I had nothing. I just smiled, knowing they owed me everything. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the guest room, silk sheets, chandelier above me, the kind of room meant to impress. But all I could think about was how hollow it all felt. Not just the house or the family, but Ethan too. His silence had spoken volumes, and suddenly it wasn't just about the insults, it was about everything I had ignored for far too long. The little excuses, the missing receipts, the nervous explanations. Things were starting to click, and not in the way he'd hoped. I got up and walked to the window. Outside, the vineyard stretched out like a painting, lit by the soft glow of moonlight. I had loved Ethan. Maybe I still did. But love, as I've learned, doesn't mean blindness. And what I saw now was a man who had taken from me, not just emotionally, but financially. 2 years ago, I helped him get back on his feet, paid off his debts, covered rent, fronted the startup he never really started. And I never asked for credit. I just believed in him. Foolishly, maybe. Generously, definitely. Curiosity itched at me. So I opened my laptop, logged into the accounts. At first, it was just to confirm what I already knew, that I was still covering more than half our expenses. But then I saw it. Transfers. Monthly, consistent, and not to Ethan, to his parents. Little sums at first, then larger ones, categorized under vague labels: consulting, family maintenance, joint investment. I stared at the screen, heart slow and cold. My name was on everything: my money, my trust, being rerouted to people who barely offered me eye contact at dinner. And that's when the shift happened. The clean snap inside me that didn't feel like anger, just clarity. I called my financial advisor, told him to freeze every channel Ethan's family had access to. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I just said, end it. Every account, every card, every transfer, starting now. Because they thought I needed their approval, but they were living off my generosity. And the charity ends tonight. I sat there for a while, staring at the dim blue glow of the screen, letting the silence of the house wrap around me like a second skin. It was almost poetic, really, how they had looked at me like I was nothing, all while sipping wine paid for by my labor. There's something surreal about realizing the very people who see you as disposable are leaning on you to stay afloat. And yet, they still manage to feel entitled to superiority. That takes talent, or delusion. I started scrolling back, digging deeper. I traced every transfer, every subtle siphon that had gone unnoticed. And not just to his parents. His sister's consulting fee, the vineyard maintenance account, a vacation rental in Nice listed under a shell name, but paid through one of my holding companies. My signature was everywhere. I had built this family's lifestyle without them ever knowing. And it wasn't even out of vanity or pride. It was love, misplaced, but once honest. And Ethan? I kept thinking about how he had sat at that dinner table, watching them pick me apart like I was an exhibit. He hadn't protected me, hadn't corrected them. He'd let it happen, probably out of shame or fear or some twisted desire to keep the peace. But the peace was costing me. Quietly, daily, in ways I hadn't even seen until now. I don't think he meant to betray me, not deliberately. But intention doesn't erase consequence, and I'd finally reached mine. I wasn't angry anymore. That had come and gone. What I felt now was colder, a sense of closure dressed as detachment. I had given freely, they took eagerly. But the generosity they mistook for weakness had an expiration date. And I had just set the clock. They thought I was naive, but I was just patient. And now, patience was no longer required. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. Not to fix anything, not my hair, not my makeup, not the tired shadow under my eyes, but to see myself clearly. And for the first time in a long time, I did. I saw the woman who had built a company from a one-bedroom apartment, who negotiated contracts in heels from secondhand shops, who stayed up nights making sure everyone around her had what they needed. They thought I was lucky to be here, but I had carried this entire trip on my back without a single thank you. I went to the closet, ran my fingers along the row of dresses I hadn't worn. Most were simple, travel-friendly, and wrinkle-resistant, practical like I'd always been. But in the back was something different. A silk piece I'd packed without really knowing why. Maybe a part of me always knew this trip would demand more than grace, that at some point I'd need armor, and not the kind made of steel, the kind made of truth, of receipts, of signatures, of legally binding reality. Before I slept, if you could even call it that, I sent one more message. This time, not to a bank or an advisor. I sent it to myself. A short note in my phone. Don't forget who you are when they try to tell you otherwise. I needed that reminder, because this house, these people, this illusion, it had tried to shrink me. And for a second, it almost worked. Almost. But now I had something better than revenge. I had the truth. And they had no idea what was coming. Morning would come soon, and with it, brunch, another performance. But this time, I wouldn't be quiet. I wouldn't smile and nod while they drained me dry. I wasn't just pulling back the money. I was pulling back the mask. And what they saw underneath, it wouldn't be who they imagined. It would be the woman they laughed at, the woman they judged, the woman who, quietly, owned every piece of their comfort. Brunch was set like a scene from a glossy magazine. Fresh pastries, imported cheeses, linen napkins folded like orchids. Ethan's mother complimented the lavender glaze on the scones like it was a matter of national pride. I sat quietly, sipping coffee, letting the warmth soothe the coldness that had settled in my chest. I wasn't nervous, not anymore. I had already made peace with what needed to happen. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about ending a charade. Ethan looked at me a little too often. His smile was tight, his eyes unsure. He knew something was different. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't touched my plate. Or maybe, deep down, he already knew what I'd discovered. I waited. Let the conversation circle around nonsense, weather, wine pairings, a charity gala they weren't actually sponsoring. And then it happened. His father sighed over his second cappuccino and muttered, "It's odd, the transfer's late this month." I placed my cup down gently. My fingers didn't shake. "Yes," I said, without raising my voice. I paused that. I thought I'd wait until I was no longer being insulted by the people cashing my checks. For a second, no one moved. It was as if the air had thickened, settled into the silence like fog on glass. His mother's jaw tensed. His sister blinked. Ethan froze. It was the first time I had seen them all truly speechless. I leaned back, unbothered. There was no drama in my tone, no theatrics, just truth, simple and unpolished. "You were wondering where the money went," I said. "It came from me. It's always come from me." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, scrolling with a practiced flick of the thumb. "Would you like to see?" And I didn't wait for an answer. I showed them everything. The wire transfers, the monthly deposits, the vineyard's ownership records. Their faces changed slowly, like shadows shifting at sunset. No one reached for the phone. They just stared. Ethan's mother's hand hovered above her glass, frozen midair. His father leaned forward like squinting would make the truth disappear. His sister sat completely still, her fork resting against her untouched omelet. And Ethan looked like a man realizing he'd stepped on a landmine he pretended wasn't there. I waited. Not because I needed a reaction, but because I wanted them to sit with the weight of what they'd taken for granted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every word landed with more weight precisely because it wasn't loud. "The vineyard you toast with? I own part of it. Legally, quietly, through a company you've never bothered to ask about." I showed them the LLC registration. "That vacation home in Nice? My signature is on the deed. You never noticed because you never asked." My voice was steady, but something in my chest finally exhaled, like a slow release after years of holding in the truth. Ethan looked at me with this strange mix of guilt and disbelief, like he hadn't known just how much I knew. Maybe he thought I'd never go digging. Maybe he believed I loved him enough to stay quiet forever. But love isn't submission. It isn't silence in the face of betrayal. And what I felt now, standing in front of his family, watching their perfect world fracture, wasn't revenge. It was clarity, the kind that leaves no room for excuses. His mother finally spoke. "We didn't know." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I gave her a nod, not of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You didn't know, you didn't ask, you just assumed. And in all that assumption, you forgot one very important truth. I was never beneath you. I was just behind the curtain, funding the performance." I stood slowly, letting the chair scrape just enough to remind them I was still in control. No theatrics, just presence. "You mocked the hand that feeds you," I said, slipping my phone back into my bag. "And now you get to watch it close the account." I wasn't threatening them. I wasn't lashing out. I was simply stating a fact, one backed by documentation, not emotion, the kind of fact that doesn't waver once spoken aloud. His sister finally found her voice. "But you never said anything." Her words trailed off, more stunned than accusatory. I turned to her, tilting my head just slightly. "Would it have mattered?" I asked. "If I had come in wearing diamonds, driving a car you could respect, would you have listened differently? Treated me better?" Her silence was answer enough. She couldn't meet my eyes. None of them could, because they knew the answer too. Ethan reached for my hand, but I didn't offer it. "Not now. Maybe not again." He whispered my name, but I didn't respond. My name, the very thing they'd mispronounced, dismissed, or weaponized, wasn't his to soften with guilt. Not anymore. He looked up at me, full of apologies he hadn't found the courage to say when they mattered. "I didn't know how to stop them," he said. I gave him a sad smile. "You didn't even try." I walked out of that room without a single raised voice behind me. Just silence. Thick, stunned, and sinking into the velvet wallpaper. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I had already shown them who I really was. And that version of me? It wasn't dressed for approval. It didn't ask for respect. It commanded it. And from that moment on, they'd never look at me the same way again. Not because they finally saw me, but because they finally saw the consequences. I booked an earlier flight that afternoon. No dramatic farewell, no last conversation over tea or wine. Just a clean exit. Ethan followed me upstairs when I began to pack. He stood in the doorway, unsure if he should speak or stay quiet. I didn't make it easier for him. Some silences aren't made to be filled. He watched as I folded my things, calm, efficient. I wasn't rushing. I just didn't want to breathe their air any longer than I had to. Eventually, he spoke. "Please don't leave like this." His voice cracked. He was trying to reach for something. Maybe remorse, maybe fear. I turned to him and met his eyes. "I'm not leaving like this," I said. "I'm leaving like me." He looked lost, like a child who had just realized the game was real. And the rules? They were never in his favor. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He tried to explain. He didn't know his parents were taking so much. He thought I'd always be okay with helping. He thought. That's the thing about people like him. They don't ask. They assume. They build entire lives on your strength and call it their foundation. I listened. Quietly. Gave him space to say what he needed. But nothing he said could change what I'd seen, or unsee the moment he stayed silent when I needed him most. When I finally zipped my suitcase, he reached out to stop me. I pulled back, not harshly, just firmly. "You don't get to keep me in your comfort just because it's convenient," I said. "You had your moment to stand beside me. You chose the easy seat at the table." I didn't owe him rage. I didn't owe him forgiveness. What I gave him instead was the one thing he never gave me in that house: truth. I walked past the grand staircase with its gilded railings and the chandelier they never stopped talking about. Funny how something so ornate could feel so hollow. On my way out, his mother stood near the foyer, holding her phone like it might deliver her from the awkwardness. "We didn't mean to offend you," she said, lips trembling between pride and panic. I looked at her, really looked at her. The pearls, the posture, the fear dressed up as indignation. I gave her a polite nod. "I know," I replied. "Offense was just the side effect. Disrespect was the intention." She didn't respond. Couldn't. Because she knew I wasn't wrong. And that truth, the one she'd spent years dressing up and sweeping under antique rugs, had finally come to sit at her feet. No crystal, no cutlery, no curated legacy could stop it. You can't out-host reality, not when the check bounces on your character. By the time I got in the car, Ethan's sister had texted me, a weak attempt at damage control. I think there was a misunderstanding. Maybe we could all sit down and talk it through. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I replied with one sentence. Just one. I don't fund disrespect. Sent it. Blocked her. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Because I knew what they really wanted wasn't closure. It was control. And that door was locked for good. As the driver pulled away from the estate, I didn't look back. Not at the house, not at the family, not at Ethan's silhouette fading in the mirror. I had nothing left to prove, no apology to give, no second round to play. They would be fine, for a while. Until the funds dried up, the facade cracked, and the silence I left behind grew louder than any speech I could have made. They judged me for how I looked. Now they'd remember me for what I took with me when I left. On the flight home, I didn't cry. I didn't replay their words or second-guess my choices. I just watched the clouds move past the window, layer after layer, like pages turning in a book I was done reading. I felt something close to peace, not because it didn't hurt, but because I chose myself. And sometimes that's the quietest, strongest kind of closure. Not a slam, not a scream. Just the soft click of a door you no longer feel the need to reopen. Back in my apartment, I made coffee, the way I like it. Strong, hot, no one correcting my pour or commenting on the brand. I sat in my kitchen, in my worn chair, and exhaled like it was the first real breath I'd taken in days. No chandeliers, no passive-aggressive toasts, just me, my silence, and the kind of freedom you can't buy with old money. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't broken. I was rebuilding, quietly, powerfully. On my own terms. They, on the other hand, were unraveling. I saw the messages come in. Ethan, his mother, a family friend asking for just a conversation. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. They were chasing the version of me they thought they could use, charm, or manipulate. But that version no longer existed. What they had now was an empty inbox and the echo of their own arrogance. And that was exactly what they'd earned. They judged me for my appearance, my simplicity, my silence. But when I left, I gave them one last gift, a clear view of who I really was. And it wasn't what they expected. I wasn't the outsider. I was the lifeline. And when I walked away, I took that with me. Not out of revenge, but because they never deserved it to begin with.